The dress cost more than my mother's final hospital bill. I know that because I checked. I stood in front of the mirror in the bridal suite on the 42nd floor of the Hargrove Grand, and I did the math in my head the way I always do when I'm terrified. I counted numbers instead of feelings. The gown was ivory silk, hand-stitched in Milan, and it had been selected by someone on Elliot Hargrove's staff without my input, without my measurements initially, and without a single question about what I might want. It fit perfectly anyway. That bothered me more than if it hadn't. The ceremony had been small, private, exactly 8 people, not counting the no flowers that I chose, no music that I recognized. His lawyer sat in the front row with a briefcase on his lap like we were closing a real estate deal, which, in every way that mattered, we were. I signed the contract 3 weeks ago at a glass table in a boardroom that smelled of leather and cold air conditioning, and I had not stopped feeling the phantom weight of that pen in my hand since 365 days. That was the agreement. 1 year of marriage, performed for the public, conducted in private silence. In exchange, every cent of my mother's medical debt, $412,000, would be erased. The debt that Hargrove Industries had purchased 6 months after she died, like vultures circling something that was already gone. I told myself I was doing this for her memory. I told myself I was doing it for my brother Liam, who was 19 and still flinching at every envelope that came through the mail slot. I told myself a lot of things standing in that suite, breathing carefully so I didn't cry and ruin the makeup that someone else had applied to my face that morning. The truth, the one I kept pressing down, was simpler and uglier than any of that. I was doing it because I had no other door left. Every other exit had been quietly sealed, and I was starting to wonder if that had been intentional. Elliot Hargrove was waiting in the penthouse when I arrived that night, not waiting the way a husband waits for a wife, standing up, reaching out, nervous in any of the small human ways that make people real. He was seated at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, reading something on a tablet. He looked up when the elevator doors opened. His eyes moved over me with the focused, dispassionate precision of a man assessing inventory. Then he looked back at the tablet. "Your room is the second door on the left," he said. "There's a key on the nightstand. The housekeeper's name is Mrs. Fong. She starts at 7. Don't leave dishes in the common area." I stood in the elevator threshold for a moment, the silk of the dress whispering against the marble floor. I thought about all the ways I had prepared for cruelty. Sharp words, cold dismissal, maybe a sneer about my background, something to remind me of the distance between us. I had not prepared for being addressed like a new tenant. "I know your name," I said. He looked up again. Something shifted in his expression, not warmly, not unkindly, just with a slight recalibration, the way someone adjusts when a variable behaves unexpectedly. "Maya," he said. "Yes." I stepped out of the elevator. "And I won't be leaving dishes anywhere, but I'd like to know the rules before I accidentally break one." He studied me for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he set the tablet down and gestured toward the sitting area across the room. 2 gray couches arranged around a low glass table, architectural, cold. I sat down. He didn't. "The rules are straightforward," he said, standing at the edge of the room with his arms loose at his sides. "Public appearances, as required. I'll give you a schedule. Media questions are handled by my PR team. You don't speak to journalists without prior approval. You don't discuss the contract with anyone. Friends, family, no exceptions." He paused. "Your brother has been given access to an account that will cover his university expenses. That begins immediately. The debt settlement occurs in 12 equal installments over the course of the year. If you terminate the agreement early, the remaining balance reverts." "And if you terminate early?" I asked. He looked at me with an expression that said the question had not occurred to him as a serious one. "I won't." That wasn't an answer. "The contract covers it," he said, and turned back toward his desk. "Read it again if you need to." I had read it 11 times. I knew every clause. What I didn't know, what no contract had prepared me for, was the black leather folder sitting open on the corner of his desk, angled just enough that I could see 3 words on the page inside before he closed it and slid it into the top drawer with one practiced motion. 3 words: Chun Lihua, deceased. My mother's name. I don't know how I kept my face still. I had spent years learning how to keep my face still in rooms where showing weakness cost you something. But that name, her name, in a folder on the desk of the man whose company had bought her debt, on the night of our wedding, landed somewhere beneath my ribs like a stone dropped into cold water, and the ripple of it didn't stop. I stood, smoothed the front of the dress, and said good night. He nodded without looking up. I walked to the second door on the left, closed it behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. I didn't sleep, not really. I lay in the dark of that enormous, perfect, soulless room, and I thought about my mother, the way she used to fold her hands in her lap during bad news, like she was physically holding herself together. The way the hospital had smelled antiseptic and overripe. Cafeteria fruit and something underneath both that I could never name, something like waiting. I thought about the 2 years she'd been sick, how we'd burned through savings and loans and the charity of people who grew tired of giving. I thought about the week she died, the week the final payment, the one that might have gotten her into the clinical trial, didn't come through. And I thought about why my mother's name was written in a folder on Elliot Hargrove's desk. The apartment was quiet by midnight. I gave it another 20 minutes. Then I got up, changed out of the dress, pulled on the plainest clothes I'd brought, dark jeans, a gray sweater, and I opened my bedroom door. The penthouse was dim, one lamp on near the kitchen. Elliot's bedroom door was closed. I moved to his desk. My hands were steadier than they had any right to be. The top drawers slid open silently. I took out the folder. What I found inside did not answer a single question. It detonated every question I thought I had and replaced them with ones I had never known to ask. There were photographs, surveillance quality, slightly grainy, taken over a period of years. My mother outside the hospital. My mother at the pharmacy. A receipt stamped with a foundation name I didn't recognize. The Wren Foundation. A series of wire transfers, anonymous, quarterly, covering costs that I remembered as impossible costs that somehow, miraculously, had been covered just long enough to keep her alive for 2 full years, covered by someone we never identified, someone we called luck, or fate, or whatever word people use for things they can't explain and can't afford to question. And then, buried beneath the transfers and the photographs and the clinical documentation, a photograph of me, not recent. I was 16 in that photograph, standing outside the apartment we'd rented in Flushing after my father left. I was carrying groceries. My hair was in a braid. I remembered that day. I remembered the cold. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that my legs began to hurt. Long enough that the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows shifted from the black of deep night to the first gray suggestion of morning. I put the folder back. I closed the drawer. I went back to my room, and I sat on the edge of the bed again. And this time, I let myself feel the full weight of what I did not understand. I had come into this contract believing I knew exactly who Elliot Hargrove was, a powerful man, a cold one, a man who used people with the clean efficiency of someone who had never been forced to be anything else. I had believed his cruelty was simple, the thoughtless cruelty of someone who has never had to think about the cost of anything. But someone had been paying my mother's medical bills in secret for 2 years. Someone had known her name, her face, her pharmacy, her treatment schedule. Someone had taken a photograph of a 16-year-old girl carrying groceries in Flushing in November, and that folder had been on his desk. I had 364 days left on this contract. I had a husband who spoke to me like a landlord and slept 8 feet away behind a closed door. And I had a secret that was too large and too dangerous to touch without understanding it first. I lay back on the bed. I stared at the ceiling. I made a decision the way my mother used to make decisions, quietly, without announcement, with my hands folded in my lap and my face perfectly still. I was going to find out the truth. All of it. Whatever it cost me. The first week inside the Hargrove penthouse passed the way I imagined solitary confinement must pass, in a silence so total it had texture. Elliot left before I woke. He returned after I'd eaten dinner alone, at a table built for 12. And he would move through the apartment with the contained efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with living beside emptiness. We exchanged perhaps 40 words a day. He asked once if my room temperature was acceptable. I told him it was. That was the most personal conversation we had in 7 days. I used the silence productively. I had taken photographs of every document in the folder on my phone the night I found it. And I spent those early mornings before Mrs. Fong arrived at 7, before the city fully woke, sitting cross-legged on my bed with the images spread across my screen, reading everything twice, then 3 times, then again. The Wren Foundation appeared on 9 separate transfer receipts. I searched it online and found almost nothing, a bare registration page, a P.O. box in Connecticut, a founding date of 11 years ago, no listed directors. No public filings beyond the legal minimum, a ghost organization wearing just enough paperwork to be real. The photograph of me at 16 I kept coming back to, not because I recognized who might have taken it, but because of the angle. It wasn't taken from across the street by someone with a long lens. It was taken from a car parked directly outside our building. Close, deliberate. Someone had been close enough to count the groceries in my arms and had chosen, instead, to simply watch. On the 8th day, Elliot knocked on my bedroom door at 6:45 in the morning. I opened it. He was already in his suit, charcoal, no tie, the collar of his shirt open by one button, in the way that, I was beginning to understand, was his only concession to informality. "There's an event this afternoon," he said. "The Hargrove Industries quarterly investor reception. You'll need to be ready by 2. "What does ready look like?" I asked. He looked at me with that same calibrating pause I was becoming familiar with. "Like you want to be there," he said, and turned away. I wanted to throw something at the back of his head. I didn't. I closed the door and started getting dressed. The reception was held in the top 2 floors of the Hargrove Industries Tower in Midtown, a building I had walked past 100 times before the contract, always with my eyes slightly down, the way you unconsciously avert your gaze from things that don't belong to you. The elevator opened into a room full of the particular kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself loudly because it doesn't have to. Soft lighting, waitstaff who moved like water around stationary objects, the smell of something expensive and floral that probably had a French name I wouldn't recognize. Elliot's hand rested at the small of my back exactly once, at the entrance, long enough to register to anyone watching, then disappeared. I understood, a prop in a performance, and I needed to perform well enough that no one looked too closely at the seams. I was managing. I was smiling at the right moments and saying the right approximate things when I became aware of a change in the room's social weather, a subtle redistribution of attention, the way a school of fish all turns in one direction without any of them seeming to lead. I followed the current and found its source. She was extraordinary looking in the way that certain women are extraordinary looking constructed, precise, and completely aware of the effect. Dark hair, bone structure, that belonged in a Renaissance painting, a red dress that was somehow both conservative and devastating. She moved through the room the way Elliot moved through rooms, like she had bought it. She was looking directly at me. "You must be the new wife," she said, arriving in front of me without preamble, a champagne glass held loosely between 2 fingers. Her voice was warm in the way that a knife is warm after it's been inside you for a moment. "I'm Victoria Lane." I'm sure he's mentioned me. He had not mentioned her, not once. "Of course," I said. Something moved across her face, pleasure, I think, at my composure. She leaned in slightly, the way people do when they want what they're about to say to register as intimate rather than threatening. "He's extraordinary, isn't he?" she said softly. "So controlled, so certain of everything. You must find it very reassuring." She paused. "Or perhaps you find it the way I eventually found it, like living next to a very beautiful wall." She straightened, her smile returning to its original, practiced position. "I do hope you're more curious than I was, Maya. Ask him about the land in Suzhou. Ask him while he still has a reason to answer you." She touched my arm once, lightly, as a period punctuates a sentence. Then she drifted back into the crowd. I stood very still. Around me, the reception continued its soft, expensive murmur. I found Elliot's eyes across the room. He was watching me from beside a group of men in dark suits, and his expression told me he had seen the exchange and had chosen not to intervene. Something in his jaw was set in a way that was different from his usual stillness. It was the stillness of someone suppressing something, not of someone who feels nothing. The land in Suzhou. I didn't know what that meant, but I recognized the tone of Victoria Lane's voice when she said it. Not the tone of a jealous ex-girlfriend making mischief. The tone of someone delivering a warning wrapped in a weapon. That night, back at the penthouse, I searched Suzhou land records for 3 hours. Most of what I found was behind paywalls or in Mandarin legal databases I could only partially navigate, but I found enough. A land parcel, agricultural zoned, outside the city proper. A sale recorded 12 years ago under the name of a small holding company, and beneath the holding company, a name I recognized. Not Hargrove, the other name. My father's name. Chen Whalen. My father, who had left when I was 14. My father, who we had not heard from in over a decade. My father, whose departure had not been loud or dramatic but had simply been an absence that one day became permanent. like a door left open long enough that you forget it was ever supposed to close. His name, on a land record, in a transaction that connected to a company that connected to Hargrove Industries' first major manufacturing site. I was still staring at the screen when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered it because by that point in my life I had learned that unknown numbers were rarely good news and always needed to be faced directly. "Is this Maya Chen?" A young woman's voice. Hospital acoustics. I know how hospitals sound in the background of a phone call. The particular quality of that ambient noise. "Yes," I said. My throat had gone dry. "We have a Liam Chen here. He was brought in about an hour ago. He was in a cycling accident near the university campus. He's stable, but he has a fractured collarbone and a head laceration that needed suturing. He listed you as his emergency contact." I was already moving. Coat, bag, shoes. I was in the elevator before I'd finished, saying I was on my way. The lobby, the street. My hands were shaking against my phone as I pulled up a rideshare, and I was so focused on the address of the hospital, on Liam, on the word stable and the terrifying insufficiency of it as reassurance, that I almost didn't notice the car already waiting at the curb. It was a black car. One of Elliot's. The driver looked at me. "Mr. Hargrove called ahead. Miss Chen. He asked me to take you directly." I got in. I didn't have the capacity, in that moment, to parse what that meant, how he'd known, how fast he'd moved, how he'd thought to do it at all. I just got in and watched the city slide past the windows in the dark, all lit glass and wet pavement. And I held my own hands together in my lap the way my mother used to, and I breathed. Liam was pale and irritable and deeply embarrassed in the way that 19-year-old boys are embarrassed when they've frightened someone who loves them. His collarbone was fractured cleanly and would heal without surgery. The headlock had needed 4 stitches, and he was complaining that they'd shaved a patch of his hair. I sat beside his bed and held his hand and did not cry until I was facing away from him. When I came out into the corridor, Elliot was there. He was standing beside the nurse's station with his jacket on and his hands in his pockets, looking at his phone. He looked up when I appeared. He said nothing. He didn't ask how Liam was, or how I was. He just looked at me in the sharp, buzzing fluorescent light of that hospital hallway with something in his expression that I didn't have a name for yet. "You didn't have to come," I said. "I know," he said. "Then why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The bill's been handled. He can go home tomorrow." He turned and walked toward the elevator, and I stood in the hallway and watched him go. And I felt the ground shifting beneath me in a way that had nothing to do with the marble floors or the cold or the documents or the land. It was something more disorienting than any of that. I was beginning to see him differently. And that, I understood, was the most dangerous thing that had happened to me yet. I went back to Liam's room and sat in the hard plastic chair beside his bed and listened to him breathe, and I made myself think clearly. The Wren Foundation, the surveillance photographs, my father's name on a land record, Victoria Lane's whispered warning. A man who paid my brother's hospital bill before I'd even arrived and then disappeared without wanting credit for it. Every piece connected to every other piece, and the shape they made together was not the shape of a simple, cold transaction. There was something underneath this contract that I had not been shown, something Elliot Hargrove knew, had always known, and had built this entire arrangement around. And I was standing directly at its center without a single clear view of the edges. I had to look him in the eye and ask, not tomorrow, not carefully, with strategy and preparation, soon, directly, whatever the cost of the answer, because the alternative, staying inside the architecture of his silence, performing the marriage, while the truth lived in a locked drawer 8 feet from where I slept, was something I could no longer afford, not just for my sake, for my mother's. I waited 2 days, not out of strategy, out of the simple biological necessity of getting Liam home, getting him settled, making sure he ate something that wasn't vending machine crackers, and sitting with him long enough that the fear of the hospital call finished draining out of my system. He asked me once, carefully, whether I was okay living there, with him, with the arrangement. He used the word arrangement the way people use clinical language when the real word frightens them. I told him I was fine. He looked at me the way he's always looked at me when he knows I'm lying but loves me too much to say so. Then he fell asleep with his fractured arm across his chest and his face finally slack and young-looking, the way faces go when they stop performing for the day. I turned off the light and went back to the penthouse and stood in the kitchen at 11 at night and decided I was done waiting. Elliot was at his desk. He was always at his desk. I sometimes thought the desk was the truest thing about him, that everything else, The suits, the controlled silences, the penthouse engineered for a life lived alone, was just scaffolding around the man who had reduced himself to pure function. I walked across the room, and I put my phone on the desk in front of him. Screen up, the photograph of the Suzhou land record pulled open. He looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long moment, without touching it. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at me, and for the first time since I had known him, he didn't look like a man in control of what was about to happen. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Sit down, Maya." "How long?" He held my gaze. "Since I was 22, he said, "when I was old enough to go through my father's private files without him knowing I was looking." I sat down then, not because he asked me to, because my legs made the decision independently. "The Wren Foundation," I said. "That was you." He didn't answer immediately. He turned slightly toward the window. The city was all dark glass and light trails below us, indifferent and enormous. He was quiet in a different way than his usual quiet. This was the quiet of someone choosing the order of words very carefully, the way you pick your footing across ice. "My father built the first Hargrove factory on that land in Suzhou," he said. "The land your father signed over 12 years ago. Except your father didn't sign it." "Not really." He was given a document in Mandarin that he couldn't fully read, told it was a lease agreement, and the signature he put on it was recorded by my father's lawyers as a permanent sale. By the time anyone might have contested it, the factory was built and your father was gone and there was no one left to fight it. He paused. "My father is a man who is very good at identifying the moment when people have nothing left to lose and using that moment precisely." The words settled over me like cold water. I thought about my father, a man I had spent a decade trying not to think about, a man whose absence I had rewritten as abandonment, because abandonment at least had the dignity of being a choice, and now I was being handed an entirely different architecture for his disappearance. Not a man who left, a man who was perhaps destroyed so quietly, so legally, so completely, that leaving was the only door still attached to its hinges. "You've known this for over a decade," I said, "and you did what with it? You took photographs of my mother outside her pharmacy. You've paid her bills from a ghost foundation and let her die without ever telling her why." The treatment funding was the only form of restitution I could make without triggering my father's legal team, he said. Now something had broken open in his voice, not dramatically, not with tears, but with the specific fracture of a man who has been holding a weight for so long he's forgotten it isn't part of his body. I was 22 when I found out. I had no independent assets, no legal standing. My father had 6 lawyers whose entire function was protecting every acquisition his company had ever made. If I'd gone public, if I'd attempted to contest the land sale openly, he would have buried it in litigation for 20 years, and nothing would have reached your family except more loss. He looked at his hands, then back at me. "The foundation was imperfect. I know that. I have known every day that it was imperfect. She died," I said, 1 week before the final payment that would have gotten her into the trial. "I know." His voice was barely above speaking level. "The wire was delayed by a compliance review on the foundation's account. 48 hours. I have not stopped knowing that for a single day since." The room was so quiet, I could hear the ventilation system. I sat with that, with the image of 48 hours, with the specific, unbearable smallness of it. 2 days. The distance between my mother's life and her death, measured in a banking compliance delay, and the particular cruelty of near misses, and the contract, I said. "The marriage. That wasn't about the debt." "No," he said. "My father's lawyers identified you 8 months ago as the sole living heir with a legitimate claim to contest the original land transaction. They were preparing to have you sign a waiver, a document that would permanently extinguish the claim in exchange for a settlement offer that wouldn't have covered 6 months of your rent. They were going to approach you through an intermediary, someone you'd have no reason to distrust." He stopped. "I moved first. The contract gave you protected legal status as my spouse, which complicated any direct approach to you significantly, and it gave me time to build the case, the real case, with documentation, to challenge my father's acquisition properly, through channels he couldn't simply close." I stared at him. "You married me to protect me from your father." "I married you," he said carefully, "because I owed your family a debt that money was never going to fully settle, and because I was running out of time to do anything that mattered." He met my eyes. "I understand if that changes nothing for you. I understand if all of this is simply more damage in a different shape." I didn't answer him. I couldn't yet, because there was one more piece, and it arrived not in his words but in the sudden, sharp vibration of my phone on his desk between us. I looked at the screen. An unknown number. But beneath it, a name that had been auto-populated by a contact database I'd set up years ago and forgotten. A name drawn from an old email address I'd saved once. From a message I'd received and never replied to. From a man I'd decided to be done with before I understood the full story of why he'd gone. Waylin Chen. My father. I looked up at Elliot. His face told me he had seen the name. His jaw was set in the way I now recognized, not coldness, but containment. His contact information was passed to my father's legal team this week, Elliot said quietly. They found him. They're going to use him to sign a new waiver, something that supersedes your claim entirely. They reached out to him 2 days ago. My phone kept buzzing. My father, calling me for the first time in 12 years, summoned back into my life by a legal team that wanted to use him as an instrument to erase the last thing my mother's suffering might be worth. I answered it. The voice on the other end was older than I remembered. Rougher, a man who had clearly rehearsed what he was going to say, and was now delivering it badly. All the preparation dissolving in the actual presence of my voice saying hello. He said my name. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been contacted by some lawyers, that they'd told him there was money available if he signed something, that he hadn't understood exactly what. I stopped him, gently. The gentleness surprised me. I told him not to sign anything. I told him I would explain everything when I could. I told him to stay where he was and wait. I hung up. I looked at Elliot. Your father's lawyers, I said. Can you stop them? Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, but the recognition of a threshold being crossed. He picked up his own phone, dialed, and when the call connected he said 4 words in the tone of a man closing a door that would not open again. Cancel everything. It's done. The call lasted 30 seconds. He set the phone down. He looked at me across the desk, across the folder, and the documents, and the 12 years, and the 48 hours, and everything that had happened between 2 families that had never been formally introduced. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then he opened the desk drawer. He took out the contract. The original, with both our signatures on the last page, the date 3 weeks ago, the terms I had memorized through 11 readings. He set it on the desk between us. He looked at it the way you look at something you are deciding about for the last time. Then he picked it up, and with both hands, steadily, without drama, he tore it in half. It's day 47, he said. I know, I said. I don't want to manage the remaining 318. He set the 2 halves of the paper down flat. His hands were still. His voice was even, but something behind his eyes was doing what controlled men do when they finally stop controlling. It was simply present, unguarded, and entirely human. I want to know if there's something here that isn't a contract. I want to know if you would stay in this apartment on day 366, for a reason that has nothing to do with debt or land or anything I owe you. I am aware that I have given you very little reason to believe I'm capable of anything beyond a transaction. I am aware that asking this is Elliot, I said. I've been watching you for 47 days, I said. I watched you send a car to a hospital at midnight without being asked. I watched you stand in a fluorescent hallway and refuse to take credit for something kind. I watched you tear up a document that protected your legal interests because the document was between us and something real. I looked at the 2 halves of the contract on the desk. I don't know yet what this is. I don't know what we are outside the architecture of an agreement. But I know that I want to find out. I met his eyes. That's not nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then something happened to his face that I had caught once before, the suggestion of a smile, faint and brief, almost accidental. Except this time it didn't disappear immediately. This time it stayed. The land in Suzhou was returned through a legal settlement that took 4 more months and cost Elliot a significant portion of his own inheritance to contest. His father did not speak to him after. Elliot said he had expected that. He said he had been grieving his father for a long time, that the grief had just been waiting for a shape. My own father came to New York in the spring. We sat in the kitchen of a small restaurant in Flushing, not far from the apartment where someone had once photographed me carrying groceries in November, and we talked for 3 hours, and resolved nothing, and began something, which is, I think, how most true things begin. Liam graduated the following year. He came to the penthouse for dinner, to celebrate. He sat at the table built for 12 and ate 3 servings of the food Mrs. Fong had cooked. He looked at Elliot across the table with the careful, measuring look of a younger brother deciding something important. Then he nodded once, as if he'd settled it privately, and went back to his food. I don't know how to explain what it felt like to stop surviving. It didn't feel like an arrival. No trumpet, no sudden lightness, no moment where I looked around and thought, this is it, this is the other side. It felt more like one morning I woke up before the alarm, and the first thing I thought of wasn't a debt or a document or a name on a folder, but the smell of coffee already made and the sound of a man moving quietly through a kitchen trying not to wake me. The specific quality of early light through tall windows in a city that, after all this time, was beginning to feel like somewhere I actually lived. I got up, I went to the kitchen. He handed me a cup without turning around, because he had learned by then exactly when I would appear. I took it,